Can you believe that an entire continent, stretching from the frozen fjords of Norway down to the sun-baked soil of Sicily, lived under a single, paralyzing shadow for 300 years? A shadow cast not by an army, but by a fleet of dragon-headed nightmares that arrived silently, smelling of salt and blood, bringing a catastrophe no one saw coming. We are not talking about simple raiders. We are talking about the Ragnarok made real, the absolute, terrifying peak of human aggression, powered by longships that seemed to defy the very laws of physics, piloted by men who believed that dying in battle was a ticket to eternal glory. They didn't just sack monasteries, they dismantled entire societies. They didn't just steal gold, they stole the future, rewriting the history of England, France, Russia, and the Mediterranean with the edge of an axe and the point of a spear. This is the story of the Norsemen, the Vikings, the ultimate barbarians, who built an empire of terror across the known world, an empire so vast, so brutal, that it should have lasted forever. But the most dangerous thing about absolute power is the moment it starts to become organized. The moment the savage, decentralized chaos of the Viking Age had to stare into the abyss of true, centralized Christian monarchy. That pivot point, that shattering moment when the bloodthirsty pagan screams had to quiet down and listen to the cold, calculating whispers of kings, bishops, and treaties. That is where the true, terrifying history of medieval Scandinavia begins. This isn't just a history lesson you fall asleep to. This is the high-octane geopolitical bloodbath of how three fractured kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, fought a relentless, multi-century war against each other and against their own violent legacy just to survive the dawn of the Middle Ages. Picture this. It is the year 1000 AD. The long ships are still sailing. The gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, are still demanding tribute in blood. But something is changing. The wind is shifting, and the men of the north are no longer just fighting monks. They are fighting each other for the right to wear a crown blessed by a distant, powerful new god. The ancient, sacred bond of kinship is dissolving, replaced by the crushing weight of royal ambition. Every fjord, every forest, every tiny island becomes a battlefield in a 1,000-year struggle for dominance that will determine not only who controls the North Sea, but who controls the very definition of power in Europe. We must understand the stakes. If Scandinavia fails to centralize, if these three emerging nations cannot find a way to forge a unified front, they will be swallowed whole, swallowed by the massive, hungry, Holy Roman Empire to the south, or fragmented into warring chiefdoms, destined to be forgotten footnotes in the sagas they themselves created. The pressure is unimaginable. The old ways, the glorious raids, the worship of the Aesir, are being systematically dismantled by missionaries armed with crosses, backed by royal decrees, enforced by brutal, ambitious chieftains who see Christianity not as salvation, but as the ultimate political weapon. Meet the architect of this violent transition, the man who understood that if you couldn't beat the chaos, you had to harness it, Harold Bluetooth Gormson. Bluetooth, The king whose name we now use every single day was not a kind man. He was a strategic genius who realized that paganism was decentralized and therefore weak, whereas the new religion offered a terrifying structural advantage, a hierarchy that stretched from the pope right down to the lowliest peasant. He looked at the endless feuding, the petty regional wars that defined Denmark, and decided that unification was the only path to survival, even if that path was paved with the skulls of his own kin and followers. He literally carved his conversion onto the Yelling Stone, declaring his dominion over all of Denmark and Norway, a claim that instantly triggered centuries of bloody conflict. Can you grasp the magnitude of that decision? The son of Gorm the Old, the last fierce traditionalist, suddenly turning his back on his ancestors and embracing the foreign faith, purely for geopolitical gain. This was not a spiritual awakening. This was a hostile corporate takeover of the soul of the North. And it was instantly met with catastrophic resistance. The moment one chieftain declared himself a Christian king, every neighboring pagan warlord saw it as an existential threat, kicking off the most brutal series of civil wars Scandinavia had ever witnessed. It was brother against brother, tradition against ambition, and the prize was the map of Northern Europe itself. But the struggle was far greater than just Denmark. To the west, Norway was a volatile nightmare of independent jarls, clinging desperately to their mountain fastnesses and their ancient gods, constantly resisting the iron fist of unification. Their story is one of relentless betrayal, martyrdom, and the ultimate sacrifice, the legend of Saint Olav, who fought and died trying to forge a unified Christian Norway with unmatched ferocity. To the east, Sweden remained the stronghold of ancient paganism for far longer, home to the sprawling, terrifying temple at Uppsala, the last bastion of the true Norse gods, where sacrifice was routine and the worship was raw, demanding, and utterly unforgiving. This is where we begin our deep descent into the darkness, the century of fire, the violent convergence of Viking savagery and Romanesque political cunning. Prepare yourself for the sagas of kings who lived by the axe, bishops who wielded armies, and a generation of Northmen caught between the glory of Valhalla and the terror of Hell. This is the true story of how medieval Scandinavia was born, not with a song, but with a catastrophic clash of worlds that left the entire region soaked in blood, fundamentally changing Europe forever. Get ready, because the shield wall is about to break, and nothing will ever be the same. The shield wall broke, not with a roar of battle axes, but with the cold, calculating silence of a foreign priest's sermon. The age of Ragnarok worship, the glorious freedom of the Longship, was ending because the very men who had once raided Europe were now being molded by its most potent weapon, the cross and the crown. King Canute the Great, the Lion of the North, stood atop an empire that spanned England, Denmark, and Norway, a behemoth state the world hadn't seen since Rome, a fleeting moment of Norse dominance on a truly global scale. He was the transitional tyrant, a Viking who learned to play the political game better than any Frankish king, maneuvering through bishoprics and diplomacy, while maintaining the terrifying reputation of a bloodthirsty sea king. His colossal power, however, was a temporary solution, a fragile bridge before the inevitable fragmentation. When a king rules from London instead of Uppsala, the very heart of the north begins to seize up, choked by foreign influence and royal demands. The Jarls, the fierce local lords who had once bowed only to the strength of their own arm, saw their autonomy vanishing into the mist of royal charters and centralized taxation, designed to fund Canute's grand, but ultimately doomed North Sea project. But nowhere was the transition more brutal, more drenched in the blood of internal conflict than in Norway. Enter Olaf Haraldsson, later sanctified as Saint Olaf. But trust me, the man who earned that halo was no gentle shepherd. He was a tyrant, a missionary armed with an axe and an unshakable belief that he was divinely ordained to smash every single pagan idol in his path and unite the scattered Norwegian chieftains under his iron fist. His goal was simple: complete centralization of power, spiritual and temporal. His methods were anything but. He didn't ask the farmers of Trondelag to convert, he demanded it, backing his theology with brutal legal codes and the swift execution of anyone who dared cling to Thor's hammer, or refuse to pay the taxes necessary to fund his growing royal bureaucracy. The result was predictable: massive, violent rebellion. The Norwegian Jarls, tired of being ruled by a zealot who threatened their ancient rights, their ancestral gods, and their deeply rooted independence, aligned themselves with Canute, the one man powerful enough to challenge the zealot king. This led to the devastating showdown at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Stiklestad wasn't just a battle. It was the symbolic execution of independent pagan Norway. Olaf died there, cut down by the very people he sought to rule. But in a twist of fate only history could devise, his death achieved what his life never could. He became a martyr, his grave instantly transforming into a miraculous source of national identity and religious fervor, cementing Christianity as the official necessary religion of the newly unified Norwegian state. Meanwhile, in Denmark, the transition was less about internal spiritual warfare and more about external political strategy, driven by the necessity of defending themselves from the hungry ambition of the Holy Roman Empire to the south. The Danes, geographically closer to the beating heart of European power, were the first to understand that the longship was being rapidly replaced by the stone castle and the heavy cavalry charge. They realized that to survive the Germanic pressure, they couldn't just raid, they had to build fortifications, permanent armies, and a political structure that mirrored the sophisticated feudal systems of their rivals. The reign of the Valdemars, starting in the 12th century, marked the true beginning of the Danish medieval state, a period defined not by raids on England, but by crusades against the pagan Slavs across the Baltic, seizing lands and turning them into profitable Christian colonies. This was calculated expansion, driven by the church and the growing necessity of land ownership and hereditary titles, the very bedrock of European feudalism that the old Viking democracy had so long scorned. The old ladang system, where every free farmer was called to service, slowly yielded to the powerful land-owning aristocracy and mercenary forces loyal only to the crown, fundamentally changing the social contract of Danish society. The church became the single largest landowner in Denmark, creating dioceses and massive cathedrals that weren't just places of worship, but sprawling economic and political centers, draining power and loyalty away from the scattered regional chieftains, and centralizing it under the twin banner of king and bishop. But the wildest, most untamed beast in the north was Sweden. Protected by its deep forests and slow connection to the continent, the spiritual heart of Norse paganism beat strongest here, specifically in the ancient, terrifying temple complex of Uppsala, the last great bastion of the Aesir gods. For centuries, while Denmark and Norway were crowning Christian kings, Sweden was locked in a horrific, generation-spanning struggle known as the Era of Civil War, or the dynastic strife. This wasn't a noble struggle. It was a meat grinder that pitted the Sverker dynasty against the Erik dynasty, both claiming the Christian mantle while constantly battling internal pagan revolts that refused to die. The very soil of Västergötland was often fertilized by the bodies of rival kings, murdered in cycles of revenge so brutal that it makes the plot of Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. The conflict wasn't just over the crown. It was about whether Sweden would remain a fractured land of autonomous tribes ruled by local laws, or coalesce into a functioning, recognized European kingdom with a single, unchallengeable royal authority. It took until the 13th century, long after the rest of Scandinavia was supposedly Christian, for the Swedish kingdom to truly solidify its identity, heavily relying on figures like Birger Jarl, who established the strategic fortress of Stockholm and finally forced the warring factions into submission through sheer centralized violence and the forced adoption of written royal law. This, my friends, is the terrifying reality of the shift. The age of the Jarl, the power of the local thing where free men decided law by popular consent, was over. It was replaced by the cold, unyielding parchment of the centralized monarchy. Kings like Magnus VI of Norway, the lawmender, didn't just rule. They rewrote the rulebook entirely. They codified national laws, effectively crushing regional legal systems and installing royal officials who answered only to the crown, cementing the death knell for the decentralized Viking spirit. Scandinavia was no longer a collection of raiding tribes led by temporary warlords. It was now three distinct, highly centralized, and fiercely competitive kingdoms. And as we barrel headlong into the High Middle Ages, these newly forged crowns are about to collide in a spectacular, history-defining struggle for regional domination, threatening to wipe one another off the map entirely. The stage is set for an epic power grab that involves popes, powerful German Hanseatic merchants, and the invention of a new, deadly social order, driven by extreme poverty and unimaginable wealth. Prepare yourself for the Age of the Kings. The Viking Age did not end with a whimper. It ended with the deafening clang of an internal civil war, a conflict waged by kings desperate to trade the wild, unpredictable freedom of paganism for the suffocating, absolute power granted by the Christian cross. We are now officially in the crucible of the medieval North, where the only prize worth fighting for was the absolute right to rule, demanded by the newly established, blood-soaked monarchies. The age of the Jarls was violently dismantled. Every time a king consolidated power, it meant the execution or forced subservience of countless local chieftains, men who had ruled their fjords and valleys like gods since time immemorial. This wasn't merely a shift in government, it was the psychological erasure of 1,000 years of cultural identity, all undertaken with ruthless, calculating precision. Leading this terrifying charge was Denmark, the geopolitical heavyweight of the North. Harald Gormson, forever known as Harald Bluetooth, understood the stakes better than anyone. He didn't just want power, he wanted legitimacy, the kind that only the Holy Roman Emperor, and more importantly, the Pope in Rome, could bestow. His creation of the gelling stones was the ultimate political flex, a physical monument declaring that Denmark was officially stepping into the European political theater, abandoning Odin for Christ. But make no mistake, Bluetooth's conversion was a calculated act of statecraft, a shield against the hungry German emperors to the south, and a sword used to cleave away the power base of his remaining pagan rivals. He established the first true state infrastructure, massive ring fortresses like Trelleborg, strategically placed not just for defense against external foes, but to instantly suppress any internal rebellion. The Kingdom of Denmark was being forged in fire, built upon bureaucratic efficiency and a terrifyingly centralized military command. Meanwhile, Norway, rugged, independent, and geographically fractured, proved to be the most resistant patient on the operating table of unification. The independent Norse Jarls of Trøndelag and Hålogaland refused point-blank to submit, seeing any single king as a mortal threat to their savage sovereignty. This resistance birthed a lineage of violent, zealous kings whose names are synonymous with forced conversion and internal terror. Enter Olaf Tryggvason, a man who returned from the British Isles not with treasure, but with a mission, using torture and execution to smash the old gods and elevate his own absolute rule. And then came Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, the ultimate symbol of Norway's agonizing conversion. His rule was a brutal whirlwind of forced baptisms, destruction of sacred sites, and a campaign of terror designed to crush the stubborn, ancient faith. Olaf II understood that unification and Christianization were inseparable. He was not a diplomat. He was an executioner who believed the only path to national unity was through absolute religious and political uniformity, backed by the sharp edge of the royal axe. His relentless violence ultimately led to his own dramatic downfall and death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, a death that paradoxically cemented his sainthood and provided the rallying cry Norway desperately needed to finally consolidate under a singular Christian crown. Sweden, always the enigma, trailed behind its neighbors, holding on to the old Norse traditions with a stubborn, cold grip. Their heartland around Uppsala remained a powerful, potent center of pagan resistance long after the Danish and Norwegian crowns were firmly fastened with Christian gold. The Swedish kings, like Eric the Victorious, had to play a slower, far more dangerous game of political chess. They faced not just local resistance, but deeply rooted divisions within their own royal families, between those who embraced the new faith and those who clung fiercely to the ancient temple and its bloody sacrifices. The transition in Sweden was an agonizing crawl, characterized by violent dynastic conflicts and the constant existential fear that the introduction of foreign bishops and foreign gold would utterly destroy their traditional way of life. But regardless of which kingdom we examine, the tools of the new monarchy were terrifyingly similar. The old Ting assemblies, where free men governed themselves, were hijacked, transformed into royal courts where the king's law was imposed and enforced with lethal authority. Rudimentary tax systems were established, not just to fund defense, but to fuel the king's burgeoning administrative class and his permanent standing military forces, the dreaded Lidang, now mobilized at the king's whim, not the people's need. This was the birth of the state apparatus, a massive bureaucratic machine that extracted wealth and demanded absolute loyalty. The jarls were systematically stripped of their power, either becoming mere royal vassals or being violently liquidated. The church, the ultimate foreign import, became the essential lubricant of this machinery. Bishops served as literate, trusted administrators, bringing the sophisticated legal and record-keeping practices of continental Europe into the harsh north. The moment a Scandinavian king knelt before a bishop, he wasn't just performing a religious duty, he was signing a contract for eternal political legitimacy, accessing a vast, established network of diplomacy and wealth that stretched across the entire continent. The year 1066 symbolically ended the Viking Age abroad with the defeat at Stamford Bridge. But at home, the internal war had been won by the kings. They had conquered their own people, transforming savage raiders into structured subjects. But as the dust settled on the bloody unification wars, the newly crowned monarchs realized they had merely traded one deadly enemy for another. The age of the sword was over, replaced by the age of the ledger, and the terrifying, cold economic power of the South was about to squeeze the life out of the fragile Scandinavian kingdoms. The true masters of the North were no longer the kings who sat upon the thrones, but the ruthless, calculating German merchants whose ships now controlled the Baltic trade routes. Prepare yourself for the ultimate betrayal, the era of the Hanseatic League. The sea foam wasn't red with blood anymore. It was white with salt, the salt of foreign coin, the currency of the deadliest empire Scandinavia had ever faced. These were not warriors in dragon ships. They were accountants in counting houses, and their ledgers were the death warrants of Nordic independence. The Hanseatic League, a shadowy collective born of German mercantile fury, was not interested in converting your soul or stealing your cattle. They wanted something far more valuable: absolute control over every single fish pulled from the North Sea, every hide shipped from the forests of Sweden, every grain of rye eaten in the royal halls. Their power base was Lübeck, the undisputed queen of the Baltic, but their tentacles stretched into every vital port: Bergen, Oslo, Stockholm, and the jewel they truly coveted, the island fortress of Gotland, home to the legendary trading city of Visby. Visby was the nexus, a golden beacon of medieval commerce, ringed by walls that housed more wealth than the combined treasuries of the Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish crowns combined. The Hansa didn't just trade here, they dictated terms. They set the prices, they controlled the shipping lanes, and they laughed as the Scandinavian kings were reduced to glorified landlords, ruling over land they couldn't truly profit from. They demanded staggering privileges, exemptions from local taxes, their own courts of law. They were literally foreign nations operating within the national borders of 3 separate kingdoms. Imagine the audacity. But one man refused to kneel to the tyranny of the ledger. Enter Valdemar IV, known to history with a dramatic flourish as Valdemar Atterdag, the restorer of days. Valdemar was the last true Viking spirit, trapped in the body of a cunning medieval monarch. He was ruthless, politically brilliant, and absolutely determined to pry Denmark out of the suffocating German grip. His kingdom was fractured, land lost to feuding counts, and the relentless financial drain of the Hansa. Yet he saw a path to power, paved not with diplomacy, but with fire. He spent years meticulously rebuilding the Danish crown's wealth, sometimes by seizing church lands, sometimes by simply defaulting on debts, a financial pirate playing the game of kings. He knew the source of the League's strength was their monopoly, and he knew exactly where to strike the killing blow: Gotland. The city of Visby was sitting fat and happy, believing its walls were impregnable and its German gold untouchable. In the summer of 1361, the earth itself seemed to stop spinning as news spread. Valdemar Atterdag had sailed east with a powerful fleet. This was not a raid for plunder. This was a declaration of total economic war. The ensuing siege of Visby is one of the most chilling, brutal episodes of this entire era. Valdemar did not bother with subtlety. His army faced a force primarily composed of Gotland peasant militia, fighting to protect the wealth of the Hanseatic merchants who barely acknowledged their existence. The resulting massacre was absolute. The chronicles describe hundreds of men, women, and children butchered outside the city walls, still wearing their makeshift armor, desperately trying to shield the city that had forgotten them. When Voldemar finally marched through the gates, the wealth he claimed was legendary. Piles of gold and silver so vast that he allegedly stripped the city bare, forcing the remaining inhabitants to pay massive ransoms. The infamous story, perhaps exaggerated, but entirely reflective of his cold cruelty, claims that he loaded 3 massive barrels with beer, wine, and gold, declaring, "Now I have captured the Baltic Sea." But every victory has its price, and Valdemar had just poked the largest, wealthiest bear in Northern Europe. The Hanseatic League was furious, humiliated, and, most terrifyingly, organized. They immediately mobilized. Lübeck, Rostock, Wismar, and the entire economic apparatus of the League demanded justice, meaning they demanded their profits back. They formed a powerful coalition, not just of merchants, but allied with the exiled Swedish nobles who hated Valdemar, and even the powerful counts of Holstein who controlled crucial parts of Denmark. The resulting war, often called the First Hanseatic War, was a devastating lesson in the power of modern finance. While Valdemar was a brilliant military strategist, he could not fight an entire continent's economy. His navy was harassed, his trade paralyzed, and when the Hanseatic fleet finally sailed against Copenhagen, they didn't just bombard the city, they systematically destroyed the Danish economy. The climax came in 1370 with the Treaty of Stralsund, a document so humiliating for Denmark that it truly marks the point where Scandinavian monarchs understood they were no longer the apex predators. The terms were crushing. Valdemar was forced to grant the Hansa free trade throughout Denmark. Worse, they gained the right to occupy and control the 4 key castles in Scania, the southern tip of Sweden, then Danish territory, for 15 years. This was unprecedented foreign control over Danish soil, essentially handing the keys to the kingdom's most profitable fishing grounds and trade choke points directly to German merchants. Valdemar Atterdag died shortly after, leaving a broken but defiant kingdom to his young daughter, Margrethe, who would inherit not just a throne, but a debt of blood and humiliation. This moment, the absolute nadir of Danish power under the shadow of the Hanseatic League, forced a radical and terrifying realization upon the remaining Nordic powers. To survive, they could not fight alone. The only way to expel the German shadow and reclaim control of the Baltic was through a desperate, politically treacherous, and historically unprecedented act of unification. The stage was set for the Queen of the North, the iron fist in the velvet glove, the architect of the ultimate Scandinavian dream, the Kalmar Union. The game of survival was about to enter its deadliest, most politically complex phase, where identity itself was the highest stake. The ancient kingdoms must either merge or face absolute annihilation. The thunder of the longships had faded, replaced by the grating sound of stone cutting stone. The age of the roving warlord was supposedly dead, yet the crowns of Scandinavia were still drenched in the fresh blood of dynastic betrayal and suffocating ambition. King Knut the Great had briefly united the North Sea into a terrifying empire, stretching from England to the Arctic fringes of Norway. But empires built on brute force and a single man's charisma rarely last past the funeral pyre. His death was the signal, a gunshot heard across the frozen fjords, that immediately plunged the nascent monarchies back into a horrifying free-for-all, shattering the illusion of stability. Every petty jarl, every ambitious bishop, saw the vacuum and immediately lunged for the throat of the centralized power structure, convinced they were the rightful heirs to the North Sea dominion. The map of the North was dissolving and reforming, seemingly every decade, a terrifying, fluid mosaic of shifting loyalties and brutal, localized power grabs. This was the true medieval crucible, where the test was not merely strength, but sheer, cunning endurance against both internal treachery and mounting external pressure. Norway, the land most resistant to organized authority, became the epicenter of this post-Viking chaos. For over a century, the proud, stubborn nation tore itself apart in what history politely calls the Civil War era, a term that utterly fails to convey the sheer depth of the internal butchery. This period was marked by brutal, fluctuating claims to the throne, fueled by desperation and ancient regional rivalries that refused to die under the new Christian regime. These weren't just courtly skirmishes. These were ideological battles, pitting the established, often church-backed lines, the so-called jarls or Halogaland parties, against the radical, rural, and fiercely independent groups like the notorious Birkebeiner. The Birkebeiner, literally meaning the birch legs, were so poor and desperate that they wore strips of birch bark instead of proper boots, making them the ultimate symbol of the disenfranchised, anti-monarchical resistance. Imagine a continuous, low-grade guerrilla war fought through impossibly rugged terrain, from the narrow fjords of Vestlande to the deep forests of the east, where loyalty shifted faster than the winter weather, and a king could be crowned one day and brutally murdered the next. This ceaseless internal bloodletting was the staggering price Norway paid for its rugged independence, a constant reminder that the Viking soul was not easily tamed by the soft promises of kingship or the rigid structures of continental feudalism. Every time a strong king emerged, the cycle would begin anew, often catalyzed by spurious claims of royal descent or outright manipulation by foreign powers eager to see Norway weakened. The very idea of a unified Norwegian identity seemed destined to drown in a century of domestic warfare. Meanwhile, strategically positioned at the gateway to the Baltic, was playing a different, far more calculated game, capitalizing ruthlessly on its geographical advantages. Under the formidable leadership of the Valdemars, a dynasty that knew exactly how to wield both the cross and the sword with terrifying precision, Denmark transformed itself almost overnight into the premier European power of the North, shedding the last vestiges of Viking-era banditry for organized imperial might. Valdemar the Great and his expansionist descendants looked past their internal squabbles, which were still bloody but less protracted than Norway's, and turned their horrifying gaze south and east toward the unprotected Slavic lands of Pomerania and Estonia. They weren't just raiding, they were systematically empire-building, seizing vast swaths of Slavic territory along the southern Baltic coast, establishing fortified bridgeheads, and converting, often at the point of a lance, the indigenous populations. This was the terrifying birth of the Dominium Maris Baltici, the brutal, uncompromising Danish mastery of the Baltic Sea, a control enforced by massive fortified castles and a burgeoning naval fleet that dwarfed anything the old Viking Age had ever conceived in terms of coordinated power projection. The irony was thick and metallic. The descendants of the pagan raiders who once burned and plundered Christian monasteries were now the zealous, often ruthless, protectors of the faith, using the holy mandate to justify mass territorial theft, land appropriation, and the subjugation of entire peoples. Denmark was the first Scandinavian kingdom to truly weaponize the medieval state structure. But as the Scandinavian kingdoms struggled for regional dominance, a monstrous, unseen economic predator was tightening its coils around their throats, the Hanseatic League. This wasn't an army of warriors trained for combat. It was an army of merchants, ruthless, meticulously organized, and wielding the terrifying abstract power of capital and credit. Based primarily out of powerful German trading cities like Lübeck, the Hansa sought absolute control. They controlled the flow of vital commodities, salt for preservation, grain for feeding the masses, fine cloth, and most crucially, the incredibly rich herring fisheries of Scania, which were the economic lifeblood of the entire region. They didn't need to conquer with swords. They conquered with debt and monopoly, establishing massive, self-governing trading enclaves, known as contours or factories, in crucial Scandinavian ports like Bergen and the wealthy island of Visby. These enclaves operated outside the law of the land, miniature sovereign states within the king's own territory, enjoying special legal privileges that crippled local merchants. If you wanted to trade, if you wanted to survive the harsh winters, you played by the Hansa's rules, and those rules were designed to funnel the North's wealth directly and efficiently into German coffers, creating systemic dependency. This external estrangulation became the silent, deadly counterpoint to the loud, bloody dynastic wars, forcing kings to make humiliating concessions just to keep their treasuries solvent. Sweden, always the most geographically isolated and slowest to centralize, was still fighting the ghosts of its pagan past, long after its neighbors had outwardly embraced the cross and the crown. The great pagan temple at Uppsala might have been burned and replaced by a bishopric, but the ancient localized power structures, the powerful lagmans, law speakers, and local thing assemblies were violently resistant to the idea of a centralized Stockholm-based monarchy. This was a battle between tradition and the terrifying, imposed necessity of the European model. The Swedish crown struggled mightily for centuries to establish consistent, unchallenged control over the vast, isolated forests and culturally distinct provinces like Västergötland and Svealand, where local warlords reigned supreme. The late 13th century, however, saw the rise of men like Birger Jarl, the true consolidator of the Swedish state, who understood that law, bureaucracy, and organized administration were ultimately more powerful than any individual Viking axe, no matter how sharp. He didn't just fight, he systematically legislated, establishing the groundwork for the modern city of Stockholm, and creating the framework of royal authority that would slowly, excruciatingly, pull Sweden into the mainstream medieval political sphere, imposing a national peace that often felt like tyranny to the fiercely independent landowners. The price of this consolidation, however, was constant, agonizing internal conflict, forcing the aristocracy to choose between the perceived freedom of the old pagan ways and the terrifying, necessary order required for national survival against the threats of the German merchants and the aggressive Danes. The transition from Viking chaos to medieval structure was not a smooth road paved with gold, but a jagged cliff face slick with frozen blood. And the kingdoms were forged in fire, but the inferno was far from extinguished. The embers of the Viking Age did not die. They merely glowed beneath the ash of the new Christian laws, ready to ignite a civil war at the slightest gust of political wind. The transition from roving warlord to anointed monarch demanded a transformation so violent, so psychologically shattering, that only the most calculating and ruthless minds could survive the test. This was the terrifying formative era where kings had to kill their own kin, their most trusted advisors, and half their realm just to keep the crown balanced on their head, a process infinitely bloodier than any raid on a foreign coast. The problem wasn't merely external conquest. The true existential threat to the fledgling monarchies came from within the newly established borders. The Jarls, the old regional barons, who saw the king as nothing more than a glorified, slightly better armed chief whose authority was temporary. These mighty lords still held the ancestral lands, commanded the local levies, and worshipped the old gods in secret, treating the new, foreign Christian faith as a temporary, bureaucratic inconvenience, imposed by men who had forgotten the taste of true power. To rule Scandinavia in the late 10th and 11th centuries was to live in a constant state of siege, where the dagger was more common than the handshake, and where your most trusted vassals might already be plotting the knife twist, ready to seize the throne the moment your back was turned. In Norway, the struggle for centralized authority was particularly agonizing, a nightmare of failed attempts and brutal reprisals that echoed across the fjords. King Olav II Haraldsson, who would later be tragically and ironically elevated to the status of Saint Olav, attempted the impossible: to unify a nation of fiercely independent farmers and sea kings using the rigid, unforgiving framework of foreign European law. His mission was not one of gentle conversion or political negotiation. It was one of absolute domination, enforced by the chilling conviction that he alone was divinely ordained to cleanse Norway of its pagan depravity. His methods were not gentle persuasion. They were the iron fist and the blazing torch. Olav systematically smashed the autonomy of the local chieftains, seizing their gold, converting them at sword point, or executing them outright when they refused to kneel before the White Christ. He believed he was purifying the land, tearing out the roots of Norse depravity. But to the powerful Jarls, he was simply an arrogant, destabilizing tyrant, disrupting the ancient balance of power and threatening their lucrative regional control. The regional aristocracy, seeing their ancient freedoms eroded by this radical Christian zealot, united against him, not necessarily for the glorious return of Odin, but fiercely for their own sovereignty and the right to tax their own people without royal interference. The ultimate showdown came at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. It was not a grand international crusade. It was a devastating, heartbreaking family feud, a savage Norwegian civil war fought on muddy fields, where the self-proclaimed King of Norway was struck down by his own countrymen, falling beneath the very banners he had tried so hard to force into singular existence. His martyrdom, though entirely unintended by the pragmatic rebels who simply wanted their lands back, backfired spectacularly, unleashing a political force far greater than any living monarch could wield. Death solidified what life could not. The Church, seeing the perfect opportunity for extreme political leverage, immediately capitalized on his sacrifice. Olav the Tyrant was quickly and dramatically rebranded as Olav the Eternal Saint, his tomb becoming the greatest pilgrimage site in the north, forging a religious and cultural anchor that finally gave the Norwegian crown the divine, untouchable authority it desperately needed to survive the internal storms. Meanwhile, Denmark, under the great Knut the Great, had briefly flirted with ruling an entire North Sea empire, a monumental political entity stretching from England across the whole of Scandinavia to the Arctic Circle. This vast, impossible construct was the pinnacle of Viking ambition, rebranded with a Latin seal and royal bureaucracy. But empires built purely on the force of a single man's overwhelming charisma are inherently fragile, built on sand. When Knut died suddenly in 1035, the entire massive construct shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, proving that even the most celebrated Viking success story could not withstand the internal political vacuum. The Danish kings were immediately forced back to their core territories, facing the relentless, grinding pressure from the south, the Holy Roman Empire perpetually sniffing out weakness, ready to absorb Denmark into the German sphere and end Scandinavian independence forever. This continuous, terrifying external pressure ironically became a binding, centralizing force for the Danes. To survive this existential threat, Danish monarchs had to pivot from ambitious overseas raiding to desperate territorial fortification and meticulous internal organization. They didn't just build stone churches, they immediately reinforced the ancient Danavik, a colossal series of earthworks, ditches, and walls, stretching across the narrowest part of the Jutland Peninsula. This wasn't a structure of conquest or expansion. It was a desperate, territorial declaration carved into the soil. We are Danish. We stand here. You go no further. The sheer scale of effort required to maintain this defense diverted massive resources from internal suppression, demanding a degree of unity, however grudging, among the Danish jarls. The crown held, primarily because the alternative, absorption by the massive German power structure, was universally reviled and considered a fate worse than death. But the most bitter struggle, the longest, most brutal resistance to the new European order, occurred deep within the Swedish heartlands. While the Goths and Swayar chieftains along the coastal trading routes had converted for economic expediency and political gain, the core spiritual capital remained tragically untouched: Uppsala. Uppsala was the visceral, terrifying epicenter of the Old Faith, the site of the great temple where human and animal sacrifices were still publicly performed, a profound, terrifying link to the raw power of Odin and Thor that the common people were genuinely terrified to sever. The kings who tried to force the issue often met a swift, violent, and messy end, disappearing into the history books as failed martyrs. The conversion of Sweden was a war of attrition spanning centuries, defined by relentless pagan counterattacks. It wasn't until figures like King Inge the Elder, in a fit of righteous, desperate fury around the 1080s, finally dared to destroy the legendary temple of Uppsala and halt the sacrifices, that the tide truly began its agonizing turn. Even then, Inge was temporarily driven out by the furious pagan backlash, proving that the roots of the old gods ran deeper into the soil than any foreign royal decree could ever reach. The final savage lesson of the 11th century was universally clear across Scandinavia. Medieval structure would not be built by soft diplomacy or gentle trade agreements. It would be constructed, stone by painful stone, atop the bodies of resisting jarls and executed pagan priests. A political structure defined by constant, brutal internal warfare, where the only true peace was the exhausted silence after the latest devastating massacre. The cost of European civilization was absolute, and the blood debt was only just beginning to be paid off. The blood money had been paid, but the true cost was just revealing itself. The new Christian kingdoms, forged in the fires of unification, quickly discovered that the ultimate terror was not the pagan enemy outside, but the organized savagery festering within the very foundations of the crown. Scandinavia had traded the glorious, chaotic freedom of the raid for the suffocating, calculated cruelty of medieval civil war. These new stone churches were not sanctuaries. They were strategic battlements in a conflict for the soul, and the kings who sat on thrones now knew true fear. The fear of assassination by their own kin, sanctioned by the very God they had pledged allegiance to. Norway, always the most rugged and rebellious of the three kingdoms, immediately plunged into an abyss of internal strife so deep it threatened to drag the entire nation back into the primeval mire. For decades, the fjords echoed not with the rhythm of oars, but with the desperate screams of the Birkebeiner, the birch legs, a faction of starving, desperate warriors, so poor they wrapped strips of birch bark around their shins for protection. They stood against the Bagler, the Crozier men, a terrifying coalition of the aristocratic elite, the wealthy landowners, and the highest echelons of the newly empowered church. This wasn't merely a dynastic squabble. This was the ideological death match between the people who clung to the memory of Viking egalitarianism and the suffocating hierarchy imported from continental Europe. Every valley became a graveyard, every hill fort a final bloody stand. The Norwegian crown was a revolving door of pretenders, bastards, and usurpers, each one meeting an end more gruesome than the last, their bodies often left freezing in the snow to prove the fragility of divine right. Meanwhile, Denmark, under the powerful dynasty of the Valdemars, watched the chaos with predatory intent, realizing that Norway's weakness was Denmark's ultimate opportunity to claim dominance over the entire North Sea. But if Norway was chaos, Sweden was an unstoppable cycle of regicide and vengeance. Swedish unification was a slow, agonizing process, often failing entirely because the ancient provincial laws, the log systems, held more sway than any centralized royal decree. Kings were not anointed by God. They were chosen by regional assemblies, the tings, and if those assemblies disapproved, the king was simply removed, usually by axe or fire. The rivalry between the houses of Sverker and Erik became the defining horror of the 12th century, a feud so total that it cemented the idea of the disposable monarch. King Erik Jedvardsson, later styled a saint, met his end not in glorious battle, but while leaving mass, ambushed and butchered by a rival faction led by Prince Magnus Henriksson. Piety offered no protection. The church steps were soaked in royal blood. The real power brokers in Sweden were not the fragile kings, but the jarls, the powerful regional earls, who manipulated the kings like puppets on strings, ensuring that no single central authority could ever truly solidify. They amassed vast personal armies and estates, turning Sweden into a patchwork of fiercely defended personal fiefdoms, where the only true law was the length of the jarl's sword. And then, against this backdrop of carnage, a single impossible figure emerged from the Norwegian darkness, Sverre Sigurdsson, a man who claimed to be the illegitimate son of a previous king, raised far from the court, trained as a priest, only to abandon the cloth and seize the sword, uniting the desperate, dispossessed Birkebeiner under his revolutionary banner. Sverre was a force of nature, an articulate, charismatic warlord who openly defied the entrenched aristocracy and, most shockingly of all, directly challenged the authority of the Pope himself. When the Church, the supposed bringer of peace, excommunicated him and demanded his removal, Sverre refused to kneel, arguing that the Pope had overstepped his divine bounds. He became the ultimate anti-establishment king, arguing that the true authority came from the necessities of the people and the ancient laws of Norway, not the decrees of a distant foreign bishopric. He fought the powerful Archbishop Erik Ivarsson, driving him into exile, seizing the church's wealth, and cementing a new, terrifying precedent. Scandinavian monarchs could and would define their own relationship with the divine, even if it meant eternal damnation in the eyes of Rome. That weapon was Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's keeper of the seals, a lawyer of horrifying brilliance, a man forged in pure, efficient political poison, who had previously engineered the capture of a sitting pope. Nogaret understood that to destroy an institution sanctified by God for 2 centuries, you couldn't just accuse them of banking malfeasance or corporate overreach. You had to strike at the very foundation of their sacred identity. The accusation had to be so vile, so repulsive, that it would turn their protectors, the Pope, the clergy, the common people, into their most zealous executioners. The charges that Nogaret meticulously fabricated were a monstrous, impossible tapestry of theological horror. Secret initiation rites involving obscene kisses, specifically on the navel, the spine, and the base of the spine, acts designed to deny the purity of Christ's suffering, denying Christ and spitting upon the holy cross, the very symbol they swore to defend in battle. And the most shocking, the most potent charge of all, the worship of a demonic idol known only by the cryptic, terrifying name, Baphomet, a supposed figure with 2 or 3 faces, or sometimes the head of a goat. The plot was hatched in absolute darkness, the royal writ sealed with the king's authority, delivered across the entire expanse of France by royal messengers, who were explicitly forbidden to break the seal until the precise, terrifying moment designated by the king. The chosen date was not arbitrary. It was selected for its comprehensive surprise and psychological impact, a day now legendary for ill omen. Friday, October 13th, 1307. In a synchronized movement across the nation, faster than any modern communication system could manage, the king's men descended upon every known Templar commandery at dawn. The surprise was absolute. These warrior monks, who had faced down Saladin's legions and controlled the flow of currency across continents, were caught sleeping, stripped of their ceremonial armor, and dragged into dungeons built by the same royal power they had sustained for decades. The immediate, desperate goal was simple: seize the riches. Philip was certain that the treasure vaults beneath the temple in Paris, the administrative heart of their empire, would overflow with the silver and gold necessary to erase his debt and fund his crumbling regime. But here, the first shattering tremor of failure struck the king's audacious plot. The royal officials searched every corner, every hidden room, every vault. They found only operational funds, basic supplies, and meticulous, empty ledger books. The unimaginable wealth, the billions in today's currency, the secret documents, the vast reserves of gold, the sacred relics of the Crusades, it was all gone. It vanished completely, spirited away as if swallowed by the very earth upon which the temple stood. This was the moment Philip realized he had captured the body of the order, but the immense financial heart, the true soul of the organization, had slipped through his desperate, greedy fingers, just hours before the dawn raid. Leading the captured was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, a man now in his 60s, hauled from his bed and instantly thrown into the king's terrible custody. The interrogation that followed was not a search for justice. It was a factory of forced confessions, a process designed solely to manufacture the legal grounds for their destruction. The medieval legal system relied upon the question, the relentless application of extreme torture to extract whatever narrative the king needed to justify his actions. The rack, the strappado, the slow-burning fire applied directly to the soles of the feet. These tools were used systematically to break the iron will of the warrior monks. Under unimaginable duress, Grand Master de Molay himself eventually confessed to denying Christ, to heresy, to the obscene acts. He signed the documents that damned his entire order, sealing their fate under the weight of his own physical pain. The king had his evidence, manufactured by agony, and Europe was aghast, yet the legal mechanism of destruction was now irrevocably set in motion. But the king's victory was still incomplete without the church's formal sanction. The Templars were not servants of France. They were direct servants of the Pope, protected by the highest papal authority. Philip needed the Vatican's blessing to make the purge legitimate across all of Christendom, not just in his own kingdom. Pope Clement V, installed in Avignon under the heavy, intimidating shadow of French military power, found himself in the most terrifying predicament in papal history. He was trapped, fearing for his own life and authority, yet bound by duty to protect the military arm of the Crusades. He initially pushed back, demanding the Templars be tried solely by the Church. But Philip's threats were chillingly tangible, his power immense, his control over the papacy absolute. The public spectacle of the confessions, even though tainted by blood and fire, forced Clement's trembling hand. The king had used the Inquisition, an instrument of the Church itself, against the Church's own sworn defenders. The Pope eventually and reluctantly capitulated, forced by overwhelming political duress to issue the bull Pastoralis Preeminentiae, ordering all Christian rulers across Europe to arrest the Templars immediately. This was the moment of ultimate, existential betrayal. The supreme power that had created them was now tasked with their absolute eradication. The immense lands, the fortresses, the commanderies, they were officially transferred to the control of the rival Hospitallers, ensuring that the Templar wealth remained in ecclesiastical hands, theoretically. But the gold, the real, legendary treasure that Philip coveted, it was still missing. It had vanished into the whispers of history, hidden by the true inheritors of the Templar secret, waiting for the day the flames died down and the world forgot the real cost of corporate liquidation, ordered by a desperate, bankrupt, and utterly ruthless king. The stage was tragically set for the final fiery judgment and the enduring curse. The clock struck midnight on October 12th. Philip's agents moved. The king's dark decree was not delivered by swift riders or royal heralds, but by a network of meticulously selected, utterly loyal agents who had spent weeks infiltrating every corner of the French kingdom. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a military-grade corporate hostile takeover executed under the cover of religious cleansing. The orders were sealed with the king's personal sigil, warning of instant execution for any man who dared open the parchment before the final, fateful hour. The silence of the night was only broken by the creak of saddle leather and the whispered names of God and the devil, a perfect duality for the tragedy about to unfold. When the sun finally dared to rise on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the sheer, unimaginable coordination of the assault became sickeningly clear. From the grand Parisian temple, the undisputed financial epicenter of the known world, to the smallest, most remote commanderies nestled in rural Burgundy, the strike was instantaneous. Knights who had slept soundly on beds of straw or velvet, dreaming of the Holy Land, woke to the sound of crashing doors and the cold steel of the king's men surrounding them. The arrest warrants were not based on evidence, but on a satanic playbook of trumped-up charges designed to make the world recoil in horror. The list of accusations read like the ravings of a madman, yet they carried the weight of the French crown and the dreaded authority of the Papal Inquisition, now chillingly leveraged by Philip. Idolatry, specifically the worship of a mysterious, bearded head known only as Baphomet. Blasphemy, the ritualistic spitting on the Holy Cross during their clandestine induction ceremonies. Sodomy, and the total disregard for the sacraments of the Church. These weren't crimes. They were spiritual poison, designed to turn public opinion against the former heroes of Christendom overnight. The audacity was breathtaking. Philip wasn't just seizing assets, he was murdering the Templars' very souls, ensuring that even if they escaped, their legacy would forever be stained by the mark of heresy. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, the great warrior who had stood before popes and kings, was seized in the heart of his own sanctuary, the temple in Paris. The shock must have been like a physical blow, worse than any Saracen sword strike. He had been a guest of honor at the king's funeral procession just the day before. This wasn't merely betrayal, it was a political assassination wrapped in a velvet cloak of friendship. De Molay, initially steadfast, demanded to know the meaning of this monstrous injustice. But the meaning was simple. Philip IV needed their gold, and de Molay was standing directly in the way of the most desperate financial black hole in European history. The arrests were followed instantly by the horrors of the French dungeons. Forget standard imprisonment. Philip's agents, directed by the king's efficient and ruthless minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, knew time was the enemy. They needed confessions, and they needed them fast. The legal process was ignored. The rights of the accused were non-existent. The only law that mattered was the law of the rack, the fire, and the grave. The Templars were subjected to methods of torture so extreme, so inventive in their cruelty, that even hardened medieval criminals would tremble at the description. Imagine the scene. A knight, perhaps one who had seen 100 battles, now shackled in a dank cell. The interrogators, cold-eyed and driven, didn't ask questions. They made demands. Confess to Baphomet. Confess to the cross-spitting. Confess, or feel the agonizing stretch of your tendons tearing from the bone. The chevalet, or the rack, was employed with savage efficiency, stretching men until they were inches taller than God intended. The water cure filled lungs until the victim felt they were drowning in their own filth. But the most infamous tool, the one that broke the most steadfast vows of secrecy, was the slow burn. Templars' feet were secured in iron boots and slowly heated over glowing coals, reducing flesh and bone to charred ruin. Men who had faced down armies for decades were broken in hours. Pain, absolute and overwhelming, is the ultimate leveler. The proudest, most devout warrior will confess to anything, even to worshiping a goat-headed idol, when his physical form is systematically being destroyed by the very crown he swore to protect. Within days, not weeks, but days, the confessions began to flow, coerced and utterly worthless, yet priceless to King Philip. One knight, upon hearing the severity of the charges, confessed that he had been forced to deny Christ and spit on the cross during his initiation, but claimed he was so distraught by the act, he immediately confessed and was absolved by his priest. Another claimed that Baphomet was merely a cat they sometimes worshipped in private, a desperate attempt to rationalize the unbelievable charge of idolatry. But the details didn't matter to Philip. All that mattered was the admission of heresy. These tortured fragments, twisted into definitive proof by de Nogaret's lawyers, were immediately sent out across Europe, sealing the narrative. The Templars were not merely arrested. They were humiliated, defiled, and erased from the moral map of Christendom. They were shown to be a nest of vipers, secretly poisoning the heart of the Christian faith while pretending to protect it. The famine reached catastrophic levels. Men stopped praying for victory and started praying for death, just to end the cold, agonizing emptiness in their stomachs. The princes, starved and furious, began turning on each other, their bitter rivalries boiling over the empty cooking pots. The stage was now set for the next horrifying act, the public trials, the retraction of confessions by the few brave souls who survived the initial torture, and the inevitable, fiery reckoning that would cement Friday the 13th in the collective unconscious as a day of pure, unadulterated dread. The Templars' greatest tragedy was just beginning. The most devastating blow, however, came not from the impenetrable walls of Antioch, but from within the ranks of the supposed leaders. Stephen of Blois, a man who had sworn the most sacred oath to God in Clermont, finally broke. He was a brilliant letter writer, a man of refined tastes, but a spectacular failure as a true warrior. He looked at the endless frozen siege, the dying men, and the insurmountable walls, and his aristocratic resolve finally crumbled into dust and despair. Convinced the entire Christian enterprise was a hopeless catastrophe ordained for destruction, he made the decision that would forever stain his name. He deserted. He packed his bags, took his remaining retinue, and fled back toward the relative safety of Constantinople. His departure was not just the loss of troops. It was a devastating dagger plunged into the heart of morale. It signaled to the entire watching world that the great Christian crusade was failing, and the leaders themselves were abandoning the cause to die in the frozen ditch. This act of calculated cowardice had immediate, terrifying consequences. On his flight, Stephen encountered the massive Sultanic Relief Army, an unprecedented Islamic force led by the legendary commander Kerboga, roaring toward Antioch to wipe the Crusaders off the map. Stephen of Blois, seeing his chance to justify his desertion, lied to Kerboga, claiming the Crusaders were already defeated, decimated, and on the verge of total collapse. This monumental lie bought Kerboga time, making him slow his approach, believing the starving invaders were no longer a threat. It was the greatest military mistake Kerboga would ever make, but at the time, it looked like the final bitter end for the Crusaders. They were caught between the immovable city and the unstoppable Islamic army barreling down on them. But even in this darkest hour, a flicker of wicked, desperate opportunity emerged. The walls of Antioch were strong, yes, but its defense ultimately relied on men. Men who, like the Crusaders, were susceptible to gold and fear and the corrosive power of betrayal. Bohemond, the ultimate pragmatist, understood that a direct assault could not succeed. Only treachery could breach the impregnable city. He began to search methodically for the weakness, the single human flaw in Antioch's mighty armor. And he found him. He found a man named Firuz, an Armenian renegade who had converted to Islam, and now guarded 3 of the colossal towers along the wall. Firuz hated his current masters, the Turkish emir Yaghi-Siyan, and Bohemond discovered that this hatred ran deeper than his current loyalties. The negotiation was swift, silent, and deadly. Gold was exchanged, and a secret, terrifying plan was whispered into the night wind. A guaranteed path to open the gates, not through force, but through calculated, cold-blooded betrayal. The fate of the entire First Crusade, the fate of Jerusalem itself, the fate of a generation of Europeans, now hinged entirely on the greed of one renegade guard and the treacherous, desperate resolve of Bohemond of Toronto.